Who's watching the watcher, unlocking Buddhism's deepest insight? What if I told you that everything you've ever known about yourself is an illusion? Imagine standing outside of your own mind, watching your thoughts, emotions, and actions unfold like a movie. It feels like a breakthrough, like you've finally awakened, like you're seeing life from a new, more enlightened perspective. But here's where it gets strange. Just as you're marveling at your newfound awareness, a new question creeps in. Who is watching? That's right. Who is the one observing everything, including your own thoughts? The question hits like a bolt of lightning. It's unsettling, profound, and deeply uncomfortable. And in this video, we're going to explore exactly why this question changes everything. You see, we often take our sense of self for granted, believing it to be fixed and permanent. But what if this self is nothing more than a fleeting thought, like everything else in our minds? The Buddha, in his infinite wisdom, warned us about this. He didn't want us to seek the true self hiding behind our awareness. No, he challenged us to look deeper. What if, instead of searching for the observer, we simply experienced the present moment for what it truly is? This isn't just a philosophical exercise. It's a path to true freedom and understanding, and in this video, you're about to uncover why. So, stay with me. Watch all the way to the end, because the insights in this video will change the way you see yourself and the world forever. Trust me, this is one you don't want to miss. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you want more life-changing wisdom like this. Let's dive in. Chapter 1: The Nature of the Observer in Buddhist Teachings. In Buddhist teachings, one of the most profound insights lies in the nature of the observer and the role it plays in our perception of reality. The Buddha's response to such existential questions is both simple and deeply transformative. When Bahiya, a seeker, approached the Buddha asking for the shortest path to enlightenment, the Buddha's words were strikingly direct. He said, "In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, only the heard. In the sensed, only the sensed. And in the cognized, only the cognized." This teaching, though brief, encapsulates the very core of Buddhist mindfulness and awareness. The Buddha doesn't guide Bahiya to search for the observer behind the experience. Instead, he directs him to simply observe the raw experience itself, without adding any mental constructs or labels. In the seen, only the seen speaks to the pure nature of awareness, where the act of seeing is simply that, seeing. It is neither a reflection of a self, nor is it something that needs to be controlled or grasped. It is just an experience unfolding in the present moment. This is the essential point that Buddhism offers us. When we meditate or simply engage with the present moment, we are often met with a quiet but powerful realization. We begin to think, "I am here, I am aware, I am present." At first glance, this seems like a deep truth. But if we stay with this thought for a moment longer, we realize that even this "I" is just another fleeting thought, like the sound of a bell that rings and fades away. The "I" that we think we are, the observer, is not a permanent fixture. It is not something that we can grasp or hold onto. Consider this: when you sit in a quiet room and listen to a bird singing, what do you experience? You hear the song of the bird. But what happens if, instead of simply listening, you add a thought like, "I am hearing the bird sing"? The sound itself doesn't change, it remains just as it was. But the addition of "I" introduces a layer of complexity that was never there in the original experience. The sound, which was free and clear, becomes something that now belongs to you. Yet in reality, the bird's song simply is. The sound is complete on its own, and any notion of ownership, the "I" who hears it, only veils the direct experience of hearing. Buddhism teaches that even our awareness, this very sense of "I" that claims to be observing, is just another transient thought. When we meditate, we often find ourselves attempting to hold onto a sense of awareness, as if we were the ones controlling it. But if we look closely, we see that this awareness flows naturally, without any effort. Just like the sound in a room, awareness moves freely, without anyone trying to own it or direct it. The room is simply filled with sound, and awareness simply arises in response to what is happening. In this way, the observer, the I, becomes irrelevant. The awareness itself, though, remains. The key here is to understand that we are not separate from our experiences. We are not a fixed entity observing a world outside of us. We are simply the flow of awareness, moving in response to what is happening in the present moment. And in recognizing this, we open ourselves to a deeper understanding of our true nature. There is no solid, permanent self behind the observer. There is only awareness. Awareness that is free, open, and boundless. This can be likened to the experience of water flowing through a stream. The stream has no inherent shape or form. It simply flows, moving around rocks, through valleys, and over time. It doesn't need to grasp onto anything, and yet it is never separate from the riverbed. In the same way, our awareness flows through life, shaping itself momentarily into the experience of seeing, hearing, feeling, and thinking. But there is no permanent river behind it, just the flow of water, constantly shifting and changing. And yet, the water is never truly lost. It is always present, moving, and living in the moment. The Buddha encourages us to see this for what it truly is, not as a concept to be intellectualized, but as a living, breathing reality to be experienced. When we stop clinging to the notion of an observer, the experience itself becomes more vivid, more clear. The act of seeing, hearing, feeling, or thinking becomes an experience without ownership. It is simply the present moment unfolding, free from the entanglements of I imagine, for a moment that you are standing in the midst of a vast forest. The sun is shining through the trees, and you hear the wind rustling the leaves. As you stand there, you become aware of the sound, the wind, the warmth of the sun on your skin. But then you catch yourself thinking, I am here, experiencing all of this. In that moment, you've added a layer to the experience. The sound of the wind is no longer just the wind. It is now filtered through the thought of I now. Let's say you take a step back and simply observe the wind. Not as something you are experiencing, but as it is, just the wind moving through the trees. There is no I involved. There is no need to claim it, to own it, to label it. The wind is simply there as it always was. The experience becomes clearer, purer, and more alive. This is the transformation that Buddhism offers us. It's not about finding a true self behind the observer. It's about letting go of the need for an observer altogether. The moment we stop holding on to the I that watches, we are freed from the burden of self-consciousness. We become like the wind, free, natural, and fully alive in the present moment. When we see the nature of the observer in this way, we begin to experience a freedom we have never known. There is no longer need to grasp at thoughts, to hold on to feelings, or to chase after a permanent sense of self. Awareness simply is. It flows without interruption, like the movement of the ocean, like the passage of time itself. And in this recognition, we find peace. Buddhism invites us to be with what is, without needing to add anything extra. When we sit in meditation, we can allow our awareness to flow freely, without trying to control it, without trying to hold on to it. This is the key to true mindfulness. Simply being present with the experience as it is, without the layers of self-attachment or mental constructs. The true liberation comes when we stop trying to define ourselves as the observer. In that space, we are free to experience life in all its beauty, complexity, and simplicity. And when we let go of the illusion of the self, we awaken to the profound truth of our interconnectedness with all things. In this way, Buddhism teaches us that we are not separate from our experiences, but one with them. We are the wind, the trees, the sun, all at once, without the need to separate or define ourselves. And in that unity, we find the true peace that lies beyond the illusion of the I. Chapter 2: Breaking the Illusion of the Self. As we deepen our understanding of the mind and the nature of reality, we come to recognize a profound and unsettling truth. The search for the observer itself is part of the illusion we have been living in. For much of our lives, we have been conditioned to think that there exists a permanent self, a core identity that is at the heart of everything we experience. Yet Buddhism teaches us that this very search for an unchanging I is what keeps us stuck in the endless loop of self-identification. It is only by releasing this search, by letting go of the illusion of a fixed self, that we can finally awaken to the simplicity of just being. The Buddha, in his boundless wisdom, often spoke of the nature of consciousness in ways that challenge our deepest assumptions. He referred to consciousness as luminous but defiled. The luminosity here refers to the inherent clarity and potential of the mind, its ability to perceive, to be aware, to know. But the defilement he spoke of isn't some inherent flaw in consciousness itself. Rather, it is the veil of our projections, the beliefs, attachments, and identities we impose onto our experience. The more we chase after the idea of a fixed self, the more it slips through our fingers. We are trapped in the illusion of a self that is forever elusive, forever shifting, like trying to hold onto a reflection in water. It seems so real, so tangible, yet it is not. This constant chasing, this endless search for the I that is watching can feel exhausting. The more we search, the more we become tangled in our own mental webs. It is like a dog chasing its own tail. Each time it thinks it has caught it, it slips away. And this pursuit, this cycle of self-identification, only reinforces the belief that there must be something to find. That somewhere buried beneath the surface is a true self that is unchanging and solid. But what if that self never existed in the first place? To truly understand this, let's think about the nature of a reflection. Imagine standing by a lake, gazing at your own image in the water. At first, the reflection seems as real as the person you see standing there. But the moment you try to touch it, it dissipates. The reflection was never solid, never real in the way we imagine. It was simply a momentary appearance, shaped by the light, the water, and your position. In the same way, our sense of self is not a permanent entity. It is a reflection shaped by our thoughts, our experiences, and the stories we tell ourselves. But what happens when we stop chasing that reflection? When we stop searching for the true self behind the observer, we begin to see that awareness itself is not owned by anyone. It simply is, it exists freely without any claim of possession. This is a key insight in Buddhism. The mind is luminous, clear, open, but it is not something that belongs to us. It is not something that we can control, manipulate, or possess. Imagine a clear sky on a bright day, the vastness stretching above you without limits. The sky holds everything, the clouds, the birds, the airplanes, but it is not defined by any of these things. The sky does not cling to any single cloud or bird that passes through it. It simply is. In the same way, consciousness holds everything, the thoughts, the emotions, the experiences, but it is not defined by any of them. We can witness the passing thoughts and fleeting emotions, but we are not defined by them. And when we realize this, when we truly see this truth, we are freed from the cycle of self-identification. Consider the story of a man who goes on a journey to find his reflection in a distant city. He has heard tales of a perfect mirror, a mirror that can reveal the true self. For years he searches, traveling far and wide, hoping that this mirror will finally show him the unchanging, eternal I he has been looking for. Along the way, he encounters many people who tell him that the reflection is the key to understanding himself. He climbs mountains, crosses rivers, and braves forests, all in the pursuit of the perfect mirror. Finally, after years of searching, the man finds the mirror. He stands before it, breathless with anticipation, eager to finally see the true self he has been chasing for so long. But as he looks into the mirror, he is shocked to realize that there is no reflection. The mirror is empty. There is no image staring back at him, no I to be found. He is left standing there, bewildered, wondering why he had spent so many years searching for something that was never truly there. In that moment, the man experiences a profound shift. He realizes that he has been searching for something that was always within him, not in a reflection, not in an image, but in the simple act of being present. The search for the self, the belief that there is a permanent I, was the true illusion. What remained when the search ended was simply awareness, clear, open, and free. In Buddhism, the liberation that comes from breaking the illusion of the self is not about rejecting or destroying who we are. It's about releasing the attachment to the idea of a solid, permanent self that we cling to so desperately. When we stop grasping at the I, we discover a profound sense of peace and freedom. We no longer need to be someone. We simply are. This shift in perception doesn't mean that we disappear. It means we stop identifying with the roles and labels we've placed on ourselves. We stop identifying with the stories we've told about who we are. We stop clinging to the fleeting sense of self that we believe defines us. And in this release, we become free to experience life as it is, without the filter of self-consciousness clouding our perceptions. The true liberation is in letting go of the search for the I and simply being present with what is. The Buddha's teachings remind us that awareness is not something that belongs to anyone, it simply is. And when we stop looking for a permanent, unchanging self, we awaken to the simplicity of being. We find peace not in becoming something, but in realizing that we already are everything we need to be. Awareness is already here. It is always here, it is just waiting for us to see it clearly, without the veil of the self. The liberation that Buddhism offers is not a distant goal or a final destination. It is a moment-to-moment realization. It is the realization that we are not separate from our experiences, but one with them. We are not the observer looking in from the outside. We are the awareness itself, free from attachment, free from identification. In this realization, we find true peace, peace that is not contingent on who we think we are, but peace that arises from simply being. And in that peace, we are free to experience life as it is, without the illusion of the self standing in the way. Chapter 3: Meditation and the Unshaped Presence. Meditation is often seen as a path to inner peace, a sanctuary where the chaotic world fades away and we are left with a sense of calm and clarity. It is easy to mistake the feeling of stillness for the final truth, the ultimate goal of our spiritual practice. As we settle into our practice, the mind slows down, the thoughts become less intense, and we begin to feel a gentle peace enveloping us. But here's the paradox: even this sense of peace, this quietude, is not the final truth. Buddhism calls us to look deeper, beyond the peace itself, because true liberation lies not in clinging to the peace, but in recognizing the absence of a self experiencing it. When we meditate, we often think that we have arrived when we finally experience a calm mind, when the clutter of thoughts fades into the background, and we feel a momentary sense of peace. We tell ourselves, "I am peaceful." But in this very thought, there is a subtle attachment, a reinforcement of the I that is at the center of our experience. The mind might say, "I have reached peace," or "I am experiencing tranquility." However, the Buddha's teachings invite us to see that even the experience of peace is an experience within the stream of consciousness. It is not the end of the journey. In meditation, this attachment can be particularly insidious. We think that by attaining a calm state, we have achieved something permanent, something that defines us. But the Buddha's profound insight challenges this notion. True freedom, he teaches, comes not in holding on to experiences, but in releasing the very idea that there is someone who is holding them. The I who claims peace is just another thought in the stream. When we stop identifying with that I, we move beyond attachment to the experience itself. Imagine a fisherman sitting by the side of a river, casting his net to catch fish. Each time he pulls in the net, he marvels at the fish he has caught. At first, he is content with the catch, but after a while, he notices that the more fish he pulls in, the more restless he becomes. He begins to wonder if there is a bigger fish, a better fish, just beyond his reach. So he continues to cast his net further and further. Eventually, the fisherman realizes that no matter how many fish he catches, he will always be looking for more. His true peace lies not in the fish themselves, but in the act of simply being, of sitting by the river without the endless desire to catch something. The fish are no longer his goal. He begins to let go of the need to possess them. In the same way, we often cling to the fish of peace or clarity in meditation, thinking that by holding on to them, we will find lasting satisfaction. But Buddhism asks us to consider, what if we simply let go of the need to hold on to the experience at all? What if the peace we seek is not something to grasp, but something that arises when we release the desire to define ourselves by it? True meditation leads us to a deeper realization that the peace we seek is not something that can be contained or held. It is like a vast, open sky. The sky holds clouds, but it is not defined by them. It holds the sun, the moon, and the stars, yet it is not defined by them either. The sky simply is. In the same way, the awareness that we are tapping into in meditation is not something to be possessed, nor is it something that belongs to us. It is the unshaped presence that holds all things but is not confined by them. This is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of consciousness as luminous yet defiled. The luminous part refers to the pure, open clarity of our awareness, like the sky, always present and vast. The defilement refers to our mental attachments, the false identification with experiences, the desire to possess them. As we meditate, the task is to peel back these layers, not by force, but through gentle awareness and insight. When we cease to identify with the experiences of peace, joy, or clarity, when we no longer feel the need to own them or claim them as ours, we arrive at true freedom. We become like the sky, vast and open, holding everything but without attachment. In this state, we are no longer bound by the fluctuations of thought and emotion. The mind is calm, but it is not a calmness that we are holding on to, it simply is. Deep in meditation, when all thoughts have subsided and the mind is at rest, we may come to a startling realization. The very sense of I, the one who is meditating, the one who is aware, starts to fade away. And in that fading, a quiet freedom arises. We realize that the sense of self was never the true essence of who we are. It was merely a construction, a fleeting thought that arose in the stream of consciousness. The I that we thought was experiencing the peace was just another wave on the surface of the ocean of awareness. This is the moment of true liberation. When we stop clinging to the idea that there is a self-experiencing meditation, we awaken to the unshaped presence that has always been there. It is the awareness that is not separate from the world, but simply is vast, open, and free. In this space, there is no longer any need to grasp, to hold, or to identify. We simply are fully present in the moment. The Buddha's teachings point to a fundamental truth. The mind is not something to be controlled or owned. It is not something that belongs to us, but something that is free to flow and move, just like the sky holds the clouds without being the clouds. The more we try to hold on to the peace, the clarity, the stillness that arises in meditation, the more we reinforce the illusion of a fixed self. True freedom, however, lies not in holding on to anything, but in letting go of the need to hold on to anything. When we release our attachment to the experiences of meditation, whether those experiences are peace, clarity, or insight, we discover a freedom beyond words. This freedom is not something we can grasp, not something we can define. It is simply the unshaped presence that is always here, waiting for us to realize it. And when we do, we find that there is nothing left to achieve, nothing to attain. We are simply present, free, and whole as we are. Meditation, then, is not about reaching some final state of peace or enlightenment. It is about realizing that the unshaped presence, the awareness that holds everything but belongs to nothing, is already here. It is not something we need to create or strive for. It is simply the truth of who we are when we let go of the illusion of the self and rest in the natural, open awareness that is always present. Chapter 4: The Peace Beyond the Search. In our spiritual journey, there often comes a moment of profound realization. The search for the true self, the one we have been relentlessly chasing, grasping for, and defining ourselves by, begins to dissolve. At first, this can be unsettling, even terrifying. We've spent so much of our lives identifying with a fixed idea of who we are, clinging to the stories we've told ourselves. We have sought peace in the idea of a permanent, unchanging I, yet when we finally let go of this search, something remarkable happens. A peace arises, but not the kind of peace we've always imagined. This peace is not a destination we can arrive at by accumulating more knowledge or achieving something external. It is not the fleeting peace that comes after achieving a goal or overcoming a struggle. No, the peace that emerges when we let go of the search for self is deeper and more profound. It is the peace that arises from the cessation of the need to be someone. It is the peace that comes when we stop searching for a final answer, stop chasing the illusion of a fixed identity, and simply allow ourselves to be present. Imagine the sky on a clear day. The sky holds the clouds, but it is not the clouds, it simply holds them. The clouds come and go, shift and change, but the sky remains vast, expansive, and free. In the same way, when we stop clinging to the idea of me, we realize that our awareness is not bound by anything. It is not something that belongs to a person, a self, or an identity. It simply is. Awareness exists freely and naturally, without any need to attach itself to the stories of who we are or what we have become. The Buddha, in his teachings, often spoke of the nature of awareness as being luminous, clear, and boundless, but also defiled by our attachments and mental projections. When we stop believing that awareness belongs to a self, when we release the idea that we are the ones who are aware, we begin to experience the true nature of our awareness. It is not something we can hold on to, grasp, or possess. It is simply present, always here, always now. This realization can be deeply liberating. The mind may initially resist, fearing that without a solid self, without the attachment to me, something will be lost. But in truth, what is lost is the burden of self-attachment. What we gain is a quiet freedom, an expansive peace that is not tied to any one experience, any one identity. This is not a loss of self. Rather, it is the freedom of realizing that we were never limited by the self we believed in. Consider the story of a young monk who, after years of rigorous meditation and study, asked his teacher, "Master, how can I achieve enlightenment? What is the final step I need to take?" The teacher, an older monk with years of wisdom, simply smiled and said, "When you stop asking that question, you will find what you seek." The monk, confused, asked again, "But how can I stop seeking? I have been seeking for so long. How do I let go of the search?" The master replied, "You are already here. The search has never been for something you do not already possess. It is only the illusion of seeking that has kept you separate from the truth." The young monk meditated on this teaching for days, weeks, and months. At last, as he sat by a river one morning, watching the flow of the water, he understood. The river flowed without effort, without need of a destination. The search for enlightenment was like the river's current. It was never meant to end in a fixed place. The river simply was, moving through space without attachment. And so, too, did his mind when it stopped grasping for answers. He realized that peace comes not from reaching a goal, but from letting go of the need to reach anything at all. This is the same realization the Buddha had when he sat beneath the Bodhi tree. It wasn't in grasping for the next insight, the next piece of wisdom, the next self to become. It was in the release of all of that. It was in sitting quietly, observing, and simply being. Another way to understand this peace is by considering the ocean. The ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, but it is not bound by its saltiness. It does not identify as salt, nor does it need to hold onto the salt to be the ocean. It simply is. The salt is there, but it is not the essence of the ocean. The ocean's nature is vast, deep, and unchanging, despite the waves and the tides that rise and fall. In the same way, our awareness holds everything, the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences, without being defined by them. Our thoughts arise and fall like waves in the ocean, but they do not define who we are. They are simply part of the flow. We are the vast ocean of awareness, and when we stop clinging to any particular thought or experience, we experience the freedom of simply being, not as a self, not as an identity, but as the vast, open awareness that contains everything and yet belongs to nothing. When we stop identifying with the idea of me, when we release the need to define ourselves, to label ourselves, to categorize every experience as mine, we begin to experience the true liberation of awareness. This liberation is not a separate experience or a final destination. It is simply the natural unfolding of the truth that has always been here. It is the peace that arises when we let go of the search for a self that we think we must become. The peace beyond the search is not the peace we expect or imagine. It is not a state of numbness or detachment. It is a peace that arises from the cessation of the struggle. When we stop fighting for control, for answers, for validation, we discover a quiet, expansive freedom. We are no longer weighed down by the heavy burden of self-importance. Instead, we expand into the vastness of existence, feeling light, open, and free. As we let go of the me that seeks, we find that we are not lost. Rather, we are more deeply connected to everything around us. We are the sky, we are the ocean, we are the river flowing through life. We are not separate from the world, we are the world experiencing itself. The Buddha's teachings offer us a path to true peace, but that peace is not something we can attain by seeking, by striving, or by clinging to any experience. True peace is found in the letting go of the search itself. It is the peace that comes from releasing the idea of a permanent, unchanging I and simply being present with what is. When we let go of the search for a final answer, when we stop chasing the illusion of a fixed self, we awaken to a peace that is vast, open, and free. It is the peace of the sky, the peace of the ocean, the peace of simply being. And in that peace we discover a freedom beyond words, an expansive, boundless freedom that is our true nature. Chapter 5: The Unshaped Presence, a Final Awakening. In the depths of Buddhist philosophy lies one of the most profound insights. The essence of our true nature is unshaped, a presence that simply is. It is not something to be found, nor something that can be grasped or controlled. It is not something that belongs to anyone, nor is it something we can identify as ourself. The unshaped presence that Buddhism speaks of is not distant or shrouded in mystery. It is as close to us as our breath, as familiar as the space we move through every day. It is the very fabric of existence, holding everything together, yet existing beyond the confines of any form or identity. Many of us in our search for meaning and truth have mistakenly believed that this presence, this awareness, is the self. We've often equated our consciousness, our ability to experience, with the idea of an individual, a fixed I. But as we peel back the layers of illusion and look deeper into the nature of being, we realize something extraordinary. This unshaped presence was never our self to begin with. It does not belong to the individual I, nor does it need the self to exist. It simply is beyond all concepts, all boundaries. In meditation, we often encounter moments where we believe we've found the essence of who we are, those moments of clarity when thoughts dissipate and a sense of stillness arises. But even then, the tendency is to think, I am aware or I am present. This very notion of an I experiencing awareness subtly brings us back to the self, reinforcing the illusion that our awareness belongs to us, that it is something we can own. But true peace, true awakening, happens when we recognize that awareness itself is not something that belongs to an individual or a self. It is simply present. It is not something we need to possess, but something that has always been here, unshaped and ever present. Consider the story of a traveler who wanders through a vast desert, searching for an oasis, a place of cool shade and fresh water. For days he treks through the burning sand, driven by the belief that somewhere in the distance, beyond the horizon, he will find the refreshing water he so desperately craves. Finally, after much suffering and exhaustion, he collapses under a tree, too weak to continue. As he lies there, he feels a soft breeze and hears the rustling of leaves, a sound that he hadn't noticed in his frantic search. He lifts his head, and for the first time he notices that he is already surrounded by shade. The oasis, the peace, was never far away. It was right there, waiting for him to stop and recognize it. This is the journey many of us are on, seeking our true nature, searching for the self or for enlightenment, always thinking it's somewhere else, beyond our reach. But in truth, what we seek is already here. We are the oasis, the unshaped presence, waiting to be recognized, not as something to be attained, but as something to be realized. What does it mean for something to be unshaped? In the Buddhist view, all forms, all identities, all thoughts and experiences are shaped. They are transient, impermanent, and fleeting. They come and go like waves on the surface of the ocean, but the ocean itself remains vast, undisturbed. The self we construct, the me that we think we are, is just another wave, another temporary form. It arises from the depths of awareness, but it is not the essence of that awareness. The unshaped presence, however, is like the deep ocean beneath the waves. It is boundless and ever-present, but it has no fixed form. It does not rise and fall with the tides of thought or emotion. It simply is, free from all constraints. When we stop searching for the self that we believe to be the essence of who we are, we begin to recognize this unshaped presence as the true nature of our being. It is the space in which all things arise, but it is not bound by any of them. It is the sky that holds the clouds, but is not the clouds. It is the ocean that holds the salt, but is not defined by it. It is not something we can control or grasp, but when we let go of the illusion of the self, we discover that it has always been here. In this awakening, we realize that we are not separate from the world around us. The unshaped presence is not an individual self that stands apart from others. Rather, it is the vast, open awareness that includes everything, yet belongs to no one. It is a profound sense of interconnectedness, where we are not defined by our personal story or our individual identity, but are simply part of the larger, boundless whole. Think of the vastness of the sky stretching endlessly above us, holding everything within it. The sky does not need to claim ownership of the birds that fly through it or the clouds that drift by. It is vast, free, and open, and so too is the nature of our true being. We are not limited by the small, personal self that we cling to. We are the vastness, the openness, the awareness that contains everything but belongs to nothing. This realization is the final awakening. It is not something we acquire, nor something that is hidden from us, waiting to be found. It is the recognition that this unshaped presence is always here, always available, simply waiting for us to let go of the search and stop grasping for something outside of ourselves. When we do this, we awaken to the true nature of our being, and in this awakening, we are free. Not as a separate self, but as the vast, open presence that contains everything and yet belongs to nothing. The essence of Buddhism points to this. The true nature of being is unshaped, ungraspable, and free. It is not something that can be understood through intellectual pursuit or found through external means. It is not something we can hold, but something we can recognize when we stop searching for it. The peace we seek, the freedom we crave, is already here. It is the unshaped presence that we have always been, always will be, and that is always with us. This realization does not diminish us, it expands us. We are not smaller for letting go of the self. We are not lost in the absence of a fixed identity. Instead, we become vast, boundless, free, like the sky that holds everything, yet is not defined by anything. When we release the illusion of self, we expand into the true nature of our being, and in that expansion, we find peace, freedom, and an unshaped presence that is ever present, always here, and always waiting for us to recognize it. This is the final awakening, the realization that we are not separate from the world or from each other, but that we are the awareness that holds everything together. We are the unshaped presence, not as an individual, but as the vast, open space that contains all things and belongs to none. And in this realization, we are free. Chapter 6, The End of the Search. What if everything you've been searching for, your sense of purpose, your identity, your ultimate answer, has been right in front of you the whole time? The teachings of the Buddha don't ask us to chase after some final, elusive truth or to dig deeper into a permanent self that we think is hidden somewhere. No, the Buddha calls us to stop the search altogether. This might sound strange at first, almost counterintuitive, but bear with me. The path to true freedom lies not in finding something more, but in seeing our experience clearly as it truly is. What we are really searching for is not an answer, but an understanding of how we are living, how we are identifying ourselves with fleeting thoughts, temporary feelings, and shifting experiences. When we let go of the search for the one who observes, when we stop clinging to the illusion of a permanent I, we find true freedom. This freedom doesn't require us to become something more or to transcend the world we know. It simply allows us to be present, fully awake, without needing to grasp onto anything. We are no longer defined by the thoughts we have, the roles we play, or the stories we tell ourselves. In this space, we realize that peace doesn't come from achieving something or reaching a destination. It is the peace of simply being alive, aware, and unburdened by the constant need to define ourselves. This is the peace of true awakening. It's not something we can hold on to, nor is it something we can possess. It simply is. Like the sky that holds the clouds, yet is not bound by them. It is free, unshaped, and expansive. It is the vastness of experience without attachment, the openness of awareness without the weight of ownership. This is where true freedom lies, and this freedom, it's already here waiting for you. But you have to stop searching for it outside, stop clinging to the idea that there's a self to find. The moment you let go of that, you will see it, you will be it. So, if you found this video helpful, if this resonated with you, don't stop here. There's more to uncover, don't just pass by. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel, because in the next videos, we'll continue this journey together. The search may end, but the discovery of who you really are is just beginning. Stay tuned and see you in the next video.